The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fading flowers when I heard the words that stopped my heart. She stood beside my father's bed, her trembling hands clutching the edge of her sweater as tears gathered in her eyes. The machines around him had already fallen silent hours ago, but his final request had found its way into the hands of a stranger who had somehow become the keeper of his last wish. She leaned closer and whispered, "Your father said you needed a wife." I stared at her in disbelief, unable to understand why my father, a man who had spent his entire life respecting my choices, would leave behind such a message. I had buried many things over the years: dreams, hopes, friendships, and the belief that life could still surprise me. But nothing prepared me for what happened next, because those few words would unravel secrets I never knew existed and change everything I thought I understood about love, loss, and second chances. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and the incredible power of second chances, please take a moment to like this video, comment below, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Heartfelt Chronicles. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that touch hearts and remind us that humanity still exists in the smallest acts of love. My name is Daniel, and at 42 years old, I had become an expert at surviving without truly living. 3 years earlier, I had lost my wife, Emma, to a sudden illness that arrived without warning and stole every color from my world. Grief transformed me into someone I barely recognized. I stopped attending family gatherings. I ignored calls from old friends. I buried myself in work because spreadsheets and deadlines were easier to manage than loneliness. People often said, "Time heals all wounds," but they never talked about the emptiness that remains after healing begins. They never mentioned how silence becomes a companion, how dinner tables become reminders of absence, and how laughter can feel like betrayal when someone you loved is no longer there to share it. My father saw all of it. He noticed the untouched photographs collecting dust on my shelves. He noticed the forced smiles I wore during holidays. He noticed that I had stopped speaking about the future altogether. While others respected my distance, he quietly worried about the walls I was building around my heart. Yet he never pressured me. He simply showed up with homemade meals, fixed things around the house that didn't need fixing, and sat beside me in silence when words felt too heavy. Then cancer came for him. The strongest man I knew slowly became fragile beneath hospital blankets. Even then, he worried less about himself and more about me. During one of his final weeks, a volunteer named Sarah began helping in the oncology ward. She was 38, with tired eyes that somehow still held warmth, and a calm presence that comforted frightened families navigating impossible circumstances. She listened to stories patients had no one else to hear. She remembered their favorite songs and brought books from the library. She treated people not as illnesses to manage, but as human beings deserving dignity. My father adored her immediately. At first, I assumed he appreciated her kindness. But over time, I noticed something else. They would sit together discussing life, regrets, dreams, and family. My father spoke openly about me in ways he never had before. He described the son who once loved road trips, terrible jokes, and spontaneous adventures before grief transformed him into a shadow of himself. After my father's funeral, Sarah approached me outside the chapel. Rain drizzled softly across the cemetery, blending with the tears I was too exhausted to hide. That was when she whispered those unforgettable words. "Your father said you needed a wife." I almost walked away. The statement felt offensive, ridiculous, and unbearably painful. I wasn't searching for romance. I wasn't ready to replace anyone. I wasn't interested in being rescued from grief by a stranger, carrying the memory of my father's final wishes. But Sarah stopped me with the next sentence. She explained that my father hadn't meant I needed someone to complete me. He had said I needed someone who would remind me how to live again. Someone who would challenge the loneliness I had mistaken for loyalty to the past. Someone who would sit beside me when memories hurt and encourage me to embrace joy without guilt. Then she handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter written in my father's familiar handwriting. He confessed that watching me disappear after Emma's death had broken his heart. He wrote that love was never meant to become a prison built from fear of future pain. He reminded me that Emma had loved my laughter, my generosity, and my ability to make people feel seen. He feared grief had convinced me those parts of myself deserved to die alongside her. At the end of the letter, he wrote something I would read 100 times over the following months. Son, surviving is not the same as living. If life offers you another chance to love, whether through friendship, purpose, or companionship, don't turn away because you're afraid. Honor the people you've lost by embracing the life you still have. Those words shattered me. For the first time in years, I cried without trying to hide it. The weeks that followed weren't magical transformations. Healing rarely arrives dramatically. Instead, it appears through ordinary moments. Sarah invited me to volunteer at the hospital's family support program. Reluctantly, I agreed. I listened to frightened husbands, exhausted daughters, and children trying to understand illness beyond their years. Their courage humbled me. Slowly, I remembered how to connect. I started answering friends' messages. I visited places Emma and I once loved without collapsing beneath memories. I laughed during conversations and realized guilt no longer followed immediately behind happiness. Sarah never pushed me toward romance. She simply offered companionship built on understanding, patience, and authenticity. Months turned into seasons. I learned Sarah carried her own scars. She had lost her fiancé years earlier in an accident and spent years convincing herself that love was too dangerous to risk again. She understood grief not from textbooks, but from experience. We weren't two broken people searching for rescue. We were two individuals learning that wounds and hope can coexist. One autumn afternoon, while distributing meals to families waiting through long surgeries, I watched Sarah comfort a frightened little boy whose mother was undergoing treatment. She knelt beside him and spoke gently, and somehow transformed fear into courage. In that moment, I understood what my father had truly seen. He hadn't chosen a wife for me. He had recognized the possibility of life, returning where grief had planted permanent winter. Love returned quietly, not through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through shared coffee during early volunteer shifts, conversations beneath evening skies, and mutual respect built over countless small acts of kindness. For the first time since Emma's death, the future no longer felt empty. Years later, I often think about my father's final gift. It wasn't permission to move on. It was permission to move forward. There is a difference. Moving on suggests forgetting. Moving forward means carrying love, memories, and loss into new chapters without allowing them to define every page. Emma would always remain part of my story. My father would always be the man who taught me strength through gentleness. Sarah became the person who reminded me that hearts are remarkably resilient, capable of expanding rather than replacing what came before. If this story has touched your heart in any way, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who may be struggling through grief or loneliness, and subscribe to Heartfelt Chronicles. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who desperately need reminders that hope still exists. Special request before we end. Please comment below and tell us, do you believe people deserve second chances at happiness? We'd truly love to hear your thoughts and experiences, because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't finding someone new. It's finding yourself again after believing you were lost forever. And perhaps that's what my father understood all along. Love does not ask us to forget. It simply asks us to keep our hearts open long enough to discover that even after unimaginable loss, life still has beautiful chapters left to write.